Africa. And the Africa that I talk about is the post-colonial Africa. The Africa which is now divided into 55 countries with 55 boundaries imposed on her. An Africa which is famous as the cradle of mankind. An Africa which is said to be great in prospect. An Africa about which there is much expectation. That is the Africa that I will be talking about as I focus on the question of leadership and followership. As I think about that Africa and her leadership and followership, and I think about her often, as all of us should, the words of a book that I read as a youngster come to mind. And any one of us who had the opportunity of reading the book A Tale of Two Cities will remember these words. It was the time, the best of times, and the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom and the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief and the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light and the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope and the winter of despair. Those words define the mother continent as we live in her today. Those who commentate about the continent never tire to say that this is a great continent. Those who care about this continent never tire to remember that this continent, divided as she is, has had many leaders. And when I allow my mind to go down memory lane, I can remember so very vividly the immortal words of many great African leaders on the eve of our regaining our independence. And many of us can see pictures of young Africans, whether in Nigeria or Ghana or Algeria or Kenya or Tanzania, celebrating when we regained our independence. And many of us can remember the words that they spoke and the promises that they made. If it was in Nigeria here, you can remember the immortal words about what they would do to Nigeria of Nnamdi Azikiwe. You can remember those words. You can remember the words of Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. You can remember the promises he made. You can remember the erudite words of the Sultan of Sokoto, Ahmadu Bello, and the promises he made, and many others. When they spoke then, those who were young saw in them the similitude of Moses in the Bible. They thought of their leaders and saw their leaders as messiahs who would bedazzle latter-day pharaohs with miracles, who would liberate them from the Egypt of poverty and want, who would cause pillars of fire to stand between them and sorrow and want, who would part the Red Seas of tribalism and ethnicity, who in times of hunger would summon manna and quail from heaven. That is what they thought of their leaders, messiahs. But today, permit me to say, in many African countries, they are saying, it was better while we waited. It was better while we waited. There is a sense in which throughout the continent of Africa, there has been disappointment with leaders at all levels. So that when on the eve of independence, we wanted to come home, now that we regained independence, we never tire to see images of our young men and women dying in the Sahara, dying in the Mediterranean Sea, being humiliated at the embassies of the erstwhile colonizers as they seek to leave our countries and the continent. It was better while we waited, they say. Which begs the question, what happened and what is happening? That we have so many individuals who occupy positions of leadership, and yet the biggest deficit is that of leadership in Africa. You know, in 1983, your own countryman, the late Chinua Achebe, wrote a little book which he could well have been writing about Africa, but he focused on Nigeria, the trouble with Nigeria. And Chinua, without mincing words, says, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a problem of leadership. Whether you agree or disagree with Chinua, that is another debate. But he had his perspective. And he was asking a question that we continue to ask about the continent of Africa. Why is it that while on average 60 years after we regained independence, the 55 countries that constitute the continent of Africa, why is it that we cannot feed ourselves? Why is it that we have no faith in our institutions? We have no faith in our hospitals? Why is it that we have no faith in our education systems? Why is it that we have no faith in our abilities? Why is it? Where has the leadership been? Why is it that so many years, while politics becomes the toy that lulls us into a false sense of security, our economies are controlled by people from other civilizations? Why is it? These are uncomfortable questions which we must pose and confront and answer if the mother continent is to realize our potential. Why is it that the mother continent is ever so negatively attractive to other civilizations? You know, as I talk about leadership, and as I think about leadership, and I think about what leaders are enjoined to do, I think about this mother continent. And many times, I see how our men and women in positions of leadership are being treated by other civilizations. And I said, oh God, where are our leaders? When the world congregates Under the G7, there are no African leaders there. The best they can do is to invite one or two, and beyond the photo opportunity, they are told to go away, and go away they do. When there is a meeting of the G20, it is the same thing. There is no African leader there. And when at the United Nations they have voted all our countries, France, the United States, China, Russia, can come and neutralize all our votes. And I say, where are the leaders in Africa? And as you observe African leadership today, they are summoned by different leaders in the world. If the Japanese do not summon them to Tokyo under UNCTAD, the Indians are summoning them to New Delhi. And if the Indians are not summoning them, the Turks are summoning them. And if the Turks are not summoning them, the Chinese are summoning them. In the next 2 weeks, they will have been summoned to the United States of America. Summoned, I use. Africans who are watching this scenario ask, where are our leaders? Which begs the question, who is a leader? Is leadership the occupation of office? Is leadership the occupation of the office of the president? Is it the occupation of the office of a senator or a member of parliament? Or the occupation of these high-sounding positions which gives us honorifics? Is that what leadership is? From where I sit, that is pseudo-leadership. From where I sit, leadership is about service. Leadership is about honor and privilege to serve. That is why I still understand the men of old, the men of wisdom who said, he who is greatest amongst you must be your servant. This is what Africa is asking for. And Africa has been asking this question since she regained her independence. You know, when one is talking about leadership in Africa, one must go into history and ask ourselves, what was leadership before we were rudely disrupted? We had our traditional rulers. How did they govern? For whose benefit did they govern? They are still there, the traditional rulers. How do they fit in the new dispensation? When we regained independence and adopted all these structures from the erstwhile colonizer, what did we expect to deliver? That great American Pan-Africanist John Hendricks Clark says that when Africans regained their independence, not a single one of them re-examined the style of leadership. All of them continued with a mimicry of the leadership that they inherited from the colonizer. And he then delivers this verdict: not a single African country will ever succeed by mimicry. And I want to submit to you that whether one agrees or disagrees with John Hendrik Clark, one must look at Africa in order to ask ourselves, what is the state of leadership in Africa? And permit me to run you across the continent of Africa, and you will see a continent that is not at ease. The continent is not at ease because the continent is suffering from a deficit of leadership. Look at Africa today. Tell me whether we are at ease in Niger. Tell me whether Mali is settled. Tell me whether there is quiet and calm in Chad. Tell me whether Guinea-Bissau is doing well. Tell me whether the Cameroons are stable. Tell me whether Central African Republic is good. Tell me whether Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Northern Mozambique, and all these countries where there is peace and quiet, whether the sons and daughters of this country, tell me whether even this great Nigeria is at ease. Tell me. The answer is, she is not. And I dare say that as long as Nigeria is not at ease, Africa will never be at ease. If Africa wants to be at ease, Nigeria must be at ease. She is the largest economy in Africa. She has a population of over nearly 200 million people. 1 in every African is a Nigerian. She is represented in every sector. If you want the best engineers in the continent, they are Nigerians. If you want the best doctors, they are Nigerians. If you want good lawyers, they are Nigerians. If you want good people, they are Nigerians. But also, if you want Yahoo boys, they are Nigerians. Nigeria is a great country. A friend of mine once told me that if you go to any part of the world and you do not find a Nigeria, leave that place, because there is nothing to do there. Nigerians are present everywhere in the world, everywhere in Africa, and Nigeria, I'm told, is a $500 billion economy. Never, ever be proud of that, Nigerians. This is an economy that should at least be a $4 trillion GDP economy. Whenever you reach that level, then I'll say Nigeria is doing the right thing. All the ingredients are there. The question is, why is it that she is not realizing our potential? When we talk about leadership, we must ask ourselves, why is it that despite the best intention of the best of us, we do not gain what we desire? You know, I said that when you look at Africa and leadership, you must go back to history. And you ask yourself what the leadership is. And we have looked at Africa that is not at ease. But yet there is a sense in which Africa has had and continues to have men and women of renown. I remember, courtesy of history, when Africa was struggling for our independence. I can remember that great meeting in Manchester in the United States of America, the Pan-African meeting. And history tells me that Nigeria was there. Chief Obafemi Awolowo was there in 1945. And I can still remember his words spoken about African unity. I remember that Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah was there. And then we remember how they came back to the continent to lead the continent. And I am still wondering how in those days, without the benefit of the internet, without the benefit of all means of communication that we now have today, that those men and women were able to govern and to galvanize the attention of the continent of Africa for the sake of Africa. They were there throughout. But even prior to that, I can still remember another great African talking about leading Africa out of our state, the great South African Pixley Kaisa Kaseme in 1906 in Columbia in the United States of America, say, Africa must be regenerated. When all these things happened, there were leaders in Africa at that time, and their mandate was cut out for them. Their mandate was to ensure that we broke the colonial chains, and we did.